Imagine Rome, not as a pile of ruins for tourists, but as it truly was. Colossal, alive, throbbing with life. A center of power where emperors dictated the fate of millions, where legions marched across continents, and the known world revolved around their commands. Now imagine that same Rome, plundered, violated, reduced to smoke and silence. Rome's fall wasn't a single event or a sudden collapse. It was a slow, corrosive process, shaped by bad decisions, internal betrayals, and foreign threats the empire ignored for far too long. In this video, we'll walk through that collapse step by step. We'll discover who those so-called barbarians really were, and why they were only the final chapter in a story that had been unraveling for centuries. Because every ruin has a beginning, and Rome's begins at its peak. In the 1st century AD, Rome seemed invincible. Under emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, from the forests of Britannia to the sands of Arabia, from the Rhine River to the heart of Mesopotamia. It was a giant, nearly 5 million square kilometers, with over 60 million people. 1 in every 4 humans on Earth lived under Roman rule. The Pax Romana ensured 2 centuries of relative peace. Paved roads stretched across thousands of kilometers. Aqueducts carried clean water to dry regions, and laws, currency, language, and architecture fostered a shared identity. The legions kept order. Trade flourished. Everything worked, at least on the surface. But behind that facade of strength, something was already beginning to crack. The empire had grown too large. Every new province demanded more soldiers, more administrators, more resources. Its economy relied on vast estates sustained by slave labor. But when Rome stopped expanding, the influx of new slaves slowed, and the system began to falter. The empire had been built on endless war, but when the conquest ended, the machine that kept it alive began to turn on itself. Taxes soared. The free population sank into poverty. Year after year, the cost of maintaining the imperial apparatus exceeded what it could collect. By the 2nd century, the empire began to suffer a silent famine, not of food, but of money, of economic oxygen. Trade routes that once brought goods from India, Africa, and deep Europe began to collapse. Constant wars, piracy, and instability made transportation dangerous and everything more expensive. Without steady tribute from far-off provinces, and without new lands to plunder, the empire plunged into a fiscal crisis. To keep paying for armies and public works, the state began debasing its currency. Less gold, less silver, more copper, more inflation. Prices soared. A sack of grain could double in price in just a few weeks. Confidence in money vanished. The tax burden fell hardest on small landowners, artisans, and farmers. Many couldn't keep their land. Others simply abandoned it. And that's when a new system began to emerge. In search of protection, thousands voluntarily submitted to powerful landowners, offering their labor in exchange for shelter, from tax collectors, from soldiers, from bandits. This model of direct dependence, and where peasants worked in exchange for safety, was the seed of what would become feudalism. But its roots were here, in the failure of a state that could no longer guarantee justice, security, or even survival. The economic collapse didn't just weaken Rome, it planted the seeds of a new order, born out of desperation. And while the economy crumbled quietly, Roman politics was anything but silent. Starting in 235 AD, the empire entered a period historians would later call the military anarchy. In just 49 years, over 20 emperors rose to power, most of them murdered, overthrown, or killed in battle. No regime was stable, no throne was safe. Generals were proclaimed emperors by their own troops. Military campaigns were no longer aimed at external enemies. They were civil wars. Roman fought Roman. Legion clashed with legion. Province turned against province. Every corner of the empire tried to assert its own authority, and Rome's unity began to unravel from within. Meanwhile, with the legions consumed by infighting, the borders lay exposed. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine. Sarmatians invaded Pannonia. Armed bands devastated entire regions. Cities were left unprotected. The population feared not only foreign enemies, but their own soldiers who looted Roman towns and villas as if they were enemy territory. The historian Zosimus described this era as a time when Rome seemed to devour itself, and he wasn't exaggerating. Imperial authority was no longer respected. It was fought over like treasure. Power stopped being a symbol of order and became a prize of war. To survive the chaos, Rome needed to reinvent itself, and its first attempt came with a drastic decision: to divide the empire in two. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian instituted the Tetrarchy, a system of government with two senior emperors, Augusti, and two junior emperors, Caesars, each responsible for a part of the empire. In practice, Rome stopped functioning as a unified empire. It became two distinct worlds, East and West. The logic behind the division was administrative. Each half would deal with its own crises, using its own armies and capitals. But while this helped in the short term, it created a fracture that would never truly heal. The Eastern Empire, with major cities like Antioch, Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, was economically stronger. It had better trade routes, fortified cities, and more defensible borders. The Western Empire was the opposite. Its capital shifting between Milan and Ravenna, it faced constant invasions, irregular harvests, demographic crises, and an army that was chronically underfunded. While the East consolidated its authority, the West was losing it. Even the city of Rome, though still symbolic, was no longer the heart of imperial power. And it was in that weakened Western Empire that the barbarians found their opening. But who were they really? To the Roman mind, barbarian was a convenient label, a way to describe anyone outside the Greco-Roman world, anyone who spoke strange languages or didn't follow Roman laws and customs. But the word hid more than it revealed. Because the so-called barbarians weren't a single people or a primitive horde without culture. They were diverse groups, each with their own identities, religions, alliances, and strategies. Among them were the Goths, split into Visigoths and Ostrogoths, semi-nomadic Germanic peoples who had already served Rome for decades as military allies. There were also the Vandals, who crossed Gaul and Hispania before settling in North Africa and building a powerful fleet, the Saxons and Franks expanding along the Rhine frontier, and the most feared of all, the Huns from the steppes of Central Asia, fast, violent, and unpredictable. But these groups didn't necessarily want to destroy Rome. Many wanted in. They wanted land, protection, and status. Some were welcomed as allies, even granted official titles like dux, and given administrative or military roles inside the empire. But Rome's arrogance made real coexistence nearly impossible. Even when welcomed, these groups were met with suspicion, contempt, and betrayal. That fragile diplomacy would not last forever. And soon the peoples, once knocking on Rome's doors, would come storming through them. Because the so-called barbarian invasions weren't sudden, random attacks. They were the result of something far larger and far more chaotic. These were not just military campaigns. They were migrations, mass movements of entire populations, tribes, clans, women, children, fleeing forces Rome couldn't control and didn't fully understand. The first major cause came from the outside: the arrival of the Huns, nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppes. The Huns were swift, brutal and relentless. Their presence on the empire's eastern borders sent shockwaves through the Germanic tribes living near the Danube. Visigoths, Vandals, and others fled in massive waves, seeking refuge within Roman territory. But there were internal pressures too. The lack of fertile land in their homelands, combined with growing populations, pushed many tribes to seek new opportunities. And even in its decline, Rome still represented stability, wealth, and hope. For many barbarian groups, entering the empire was a matter of survival and a chance to rise. The problem was, Rome no longer had the structure to absorb them. Its borders were weakened, its officials corrupt, its resources stretched thin. Attempts at negotiated integration often failed, undermined by bad faith, poor planning, or outright prejudice. What could have been cooperation turned into conflict. Migrations became avalanches. One tribe pushed another, which in turn pressured the next, until entire regions were on the move. Some came seeking peace, others came seeking plunder. But the empire, increasingly unstable, no longer had the strength to respond. For centuries, Rome had successfully used barbarian groups to its advantage. Many had been welcomed as foederati, entire peoples allowed to settle within the empire in exchange for military support. In practice, this meant thousands of Germanic, Allan, Vandal, and Gothic soldiers served under Roman banners, guarding borders, patrolling roads, and fighting shared enemies. Some even rose to high-ranking positions. Barbarian leaders were granted titles like dux or comes, governed entire regions, and married into Roman aristocracy. It seemed like a functioning alliance, but beneath the surface, there was constant tension. Romans never saw them as equals. Even when essential, they were met with distrust, humiliation, and contempt. Promises of land and supplies were often broken. Bribes were demanded. Food was denied. Abuse was common. That systemic disdain turned allies into enemies. And in 378 AD, the pressure exploded. In 378 AD, the tension finally erupted at the Battle of Adrianople. The Visigoths, mistreated by Roman officials while seeking asylum, rose up in rebellion. Emperor Valens marched to confront them, confident but unprepared. The result was a disaster. Valens was killed on the battlefield. Roughly 2/3 of his army was wiped out. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a symbol, a brutal reminder that the barbarians were no longer just background players. They were now a central force in Rome's story. And as the Goths carved their place into history, an even more terrifying storm approached. A name that would haunt the empire forever: Attila. While Rome was still struggling with Goths and Vandals, a new force was rising, wild, fast, and unstoppable. Emerging from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns seemed like a nightmare come to life. They rode small but agile horses, wielded composite bows that could pierce armor from a distance, and fought with a ferocity that shook even Rome's most hardened soldiers. But the true terror began in 434 AD, when Attila took command. Attila united scattered tribes, imposed discipline on nomadic warriors, and transformed the Huns into a transcontinental superpower. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a political leader, a cunning diplomat, and a ruthless strategist. He negotiated with Rome when it suited him and razed cities when it didn't. Under Attila, the Huns invaded the Balkans, threatened Constantinople, demanded enormous tributes, and ravaged lands from the Danube to the Black Sea. And when he turned his gaze westward, chaos spread like wildfire. Roman sources didn't know how to describe him, so they called him flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. Not out of piety, but because they couldn't imagine another explanation for such devastation. But Attila wasn't done yet. His most ambitious campaign was still to come, one that would bring the Western Roman Empire to the edge of collapse. In 451 AD, Attila launched his boldest offensive yet, the invasion of Gaul. But this wasn't just another campaign. It was a direct attempt to break the spine of the Western Roman Empire. City after city fell. Panic spread. Collapse seemed inevitable. But then, against all odds, an unlikely alliance formed. Flavius Aetius, one of Rome's last great generals, managed to assemble a coalition of imperial soldiers. Visigoths, led by Theodoric I and other federated peoples. It was the empire's final stand, throwing everything it had left onto the battlefield. The clash took place on the Catalonian plains, one of the bloodiest battles of late antiquity. Attila was stopped. Theodoric fell in combat. And though Attila retreated with part of his army, Rome had barely survived. But the relief was short-lived. The very next year, in 452, Attila returned, this time invading Italy itself. Cities like Aquileia were obliterated. The entire peninsula descended into chaos. Rome, once again, seemed doomed. And then something unexpected happened. Pope Leo I personally met with Attila. No one knows exactly what was said. Some speak of a miracle, others of bribes, or threats of famine and plague. Whatever the reason, Attila turned back. Rome was spared once more. But just 2 years later, Attila died. His nomadic empire fractured, but the damage was already done. Rome had survived physically, but psychologically, it was on its knees. And the truth is, even before Attila had threatened its gates, the unthinkable had already happened. In 410 AD, the Eternal City, Rome, untouched by invaders for nearly 8 centuries, fell. But the one who brought it down wasn't some distant foreign enemy. It was a former ally, turned bitter adversary. Alaric, king of the Visigoths. For years, Alaric had served Rome. He fought as a general, sought negotiations, demanded fair payment, but he was ignored, betrayed, and humiliated time and again. Eventually, he realized the empire would never honor its promises, so he made a historic decision to march on Rome. By then, Rome was no longer the administrative capital, but it remained the symbolic heart of the empire. When its gates opened, there was little resistance. For 3 days, the Visigoths looted temples, mansions, warehouses, and monuments. There was no mass slaughter, no total destruction, but the psychological impact was devastating. The world watched in disbelief. To many at the time, it wasn't just a sack, it was the end of an era. St. Jerome wrote in horror, "The world is collapsing." Alaric didn't physically destroy Rome, but he shattered its myth. And that myth was what still held the empire together in the minds of many. From that moment on, the illusion of Rome's invincibility was gone. And if the Visigoths had proven that Rome could fall, the Vandals would show, a few decades later, that it could be looted again, with even more precision. 45 years after Alaric's sack, Rome would be plundered again, but this time, the devastation wouldn't come by land, but by sea. In 455 AD, Genseric, king of the Vandals, crossed the Mediterranean with a powerful fleet. He landed on the Italian coast and marched straight toward the city. Rome was once again defenseless. Its army was practically non-existent. The government was in disarray. The emperor had been assassinated just days earlier, leaving a power vacuum. There was no resistance. For 14 days, the Vandals carried out a meticulous, organized plundering. Unlike the Visigoths, driven by frustration and urgency, the Vandals had a plan. They knew exactly what they were after: gold, silver, jewels, statues, sacred relics. Even the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem, brought to Rome centuries earlier by Titus, were taken. Genseric also seized high-value hostages, including the widowed Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters, prized for both political and symbolic reasons. Once again, Rome was spared from total destruction. But what remained was a hollowed-out city, stripped to the bone, drained of its authority and dignity. The cultural impact was so deep that, centuries later, the name Vandal would no longer refer to a people, but to blind, senseless, savage destruction. Even though Genseric's sack had been surgically calculated, collective memory turned it into a symbol of devastation. And the most symbolic part? By then, Rome wasn't even the capital of the empire anymore. The imperial throne had been moved to Ravenna, but even far from the center of power, Rome remained the soul of the empire, and now that soul was empty. In 475 AD, a teenager ascended to the throne, a boy whose name sounded like a prophecy, Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, like Rome's mythical founder. Augustus, like the first emperor. But this young man would found nothing. He would become the symbol of the end. Placed on the throne by his father, the Roman Germanic general Orestes, Romulus was a figurehead, an emperor in name only. He ruled over a Western empire with no real army, no control over vast territories, and no meaningful authority. He governed from Ravenna, far from historical Rome, with little influence and even less support. The following year, Odoacer, a leader of barbarian troops serving under the Roman banner, demanded land in Italy for his men. Orestes refused. Odoacer responded by marching on Ravenna, defeating the imperial forces and deposing Romulus without much bloodshed. The boy was spared. Exiled with a modest pension, he quietly disappeared from history. But what came next was unprecedented. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor. The throne was left vacant and would remain so. There was no epic battle, no heroic last stand. The greatest empire in Western history ended in silence, dismantled from within, eaten away by decades of arrogance, neglect, and decay. The Western Roman Empire had officially fallen. Rome's fall was an ending, but also a beginning. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD didn't mean the disappearance of Roman culture or the extinction of its influence. Quite the opposite. Its laws, its language, its architecture, and even its religion lived on. They were absorbed, reshaped, and carried forward by new kingdoms, new rulers, and new civilizations that rose from the empire's ruins. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 more years. But in the West, what remained were fragments. Cathedrals built using columns from pagan temples, Germanic kings adopting Roman titles, monks copying manuscripts of classical authors. The medieval world born from Rome's ashes was different, more rural, more fragmented, more unstable. But at its core, in its very foundations, Rome was still present, in every written law, in every word of vulgar Latin that would evolve into the Romance languages, in every vision of imperial power. Rome kept whispering. If this video gave you a new perspective on how empires truly fall and how they can live on in other forms, subscribe to the channel and comment. What moment do you think truly marked the end of Rome? And as always, let part guide you in battle.